Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the CGD seminar. So today it is my pleasure to introduce James Arnott of the Aspen Global Change Institute, where he has been the executive director since 2020, but associated with the Institute since 2008. So James's research is focused on the use of science to support climate and sustainability decision-making. He holds a PhD from University of Michigan, where he worked with Maria Carmen Lemos and Ricky Rude, and a BA in political science from Principia College. Today he's going to be speaking with us on the science of actionable knowledge, comparing and improving models for how we do science. So James is additionally the co-lead of the Science of Actionable Knowledge group, which centers around social science perspectives investigating the drivers of knowledge use. In 2017, he founded the Mountain West Climate Service Partnership. In 2011, he was awarded the McCloy Fellowship in Environmental Policy from the American Council of Germany. And then my personal favorite, prior to joining AGCI in 2008, James worked on the Flux Farm, which was an experimental farm for exploring the use of biochar for carbon sequestration. Now, those of you that are joining us online, as we've done in the past, you will ask questions via our Slido page. And so if you just go to slido.com, find the CGD seminar page, you'll be able to ask questions at the end of James's presentation, as will people that are currently joining us in person. And so with that, I will hand it off to James.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you all for being here. And hopefully you can hear me online as well. So great. Well, there's a prepositional change in my bio. I actually didn't work on the farm. I worked for the farm doing a desktop analysis of the cost, the economic cost of applying biochar. And it was the first paper I ever published. And some people still come up to me and start asking me questions about biochar. And I have nothing new to share since 2008. So I really encourage any dialogue and questions on anything except for biochar, please. I really appreciate the invitation to come and talk about this question of actionable knowledge that has been an interest of mine for some time. I've been really interested in how others are taking up this question, including what Monica and Peter and others here have been exploring the question. So I just want to share a little bit from my perspective, working at the Aspen Global Change Institute, engaging in some of the social science literature, and more recently, contributing to it. But hopefully we can start a conversation. Maybe some of you will continue on towards lunch. I'm really appreciative to be here. I guess the motivation cutting across all the things that I'm doing right now is trying to make sense of this moment that we're living in that feels like an inflection point in science and in society. Here's a picture of the Science March. I'm not going to bring exactly the same level of enthusiasm as this guy is bringing to the talk, but hopefully I can sustain your interest. Thinking about where do we go from here? On the one hand, it's really exciting, I think, for many to see science and scientific institutions and scientists coming out of their shell somewhat, engaging in society and in problem solving in ways that have not been customary, at least for many decades within the scientific community. But at the same time, I think, and maybe some of you will agree and fall on one side or another of some tensions that are unresolved. For example, there's a lot that's been written about encouraging scientists to engage early and often with society and the people that would use science to inform their decision making. But on the other hand, we have these ideas kind of deep in our memory about the importance of scientists being free to follow the facts wherever they lead, to be somewhat independent from the fray of the street, the realm of values and opinions and politics. And that's another tension that's out there in terms of, is science political or apolitical? It's kind of been commonplace to say for many decades that science is apolitical. And that conjecture has come under a lot of scrutiny lately. But even those that would argue for a role of science in politics still see a value of thinking about how to remove science from some elements of the political process. And then we have a lot of mandates about us, like science improved decisions, or decisions should be informed by the best available science. But I think as many of you have wrestled with, actually identifying what is the best science can be really challenging. And the way that decisions are made in actuality are often very multifaceted and informed by many different inputs. And maybe you could argue in a democracy, we want to actually have decision making not just informed by one stream of inputs, by a plurality of perspectives. And then lastly, there's, I think we might feel like these calls for engagement with society are very well intentioned, and many of them are. But as they've been translated into actions, so for example, the National Science Foundation created a funding program called Navigating the New Arctic, which put a lot of resources into scientists going out and doing studies in the Arctic, encouraging all of the PIs to create partnerships with native Alaskan communities. And in response, a consortium of Native Alaskan tribes wrote the NSF and said, hey, stop. All of these scientists are coming and asking for our partnership so they can validate their grants and get money for their funding. And they're doing it with this expectation they're going to provide things of value, but really what we need are fundamental financial resources to build our capacity. And we don't want to just be the target of engagement for someone else's financial reward. So there's real tensions here that I think are worth exploring. I wanted to enter this space in a sequence of 3 parts. First, to take a little bit of a historical perspective on different models and modes for doing science. I realize I'm using a lot of words that mean different things, especially within these walls. So, it's interesting, a mode is a manner in which something occurs or experienced, and a model is a system or a thing used as an example to imitate or a simplified description to assist predictions. And so we have models that help us predict what will become successful science, and they've permeated politics and funding institutions and scientific institutions. And then there's the way that we actually do our science. And so I'm going to kind of engage across that space a little bit. And then talk about the work that Monica alluded to, the Science of Actionable Knowledge group working to understand, compare, and come up with ideas about how to improve models for how we produce actionable science. And then think about how all these different models come together and make an argument that we need to actually have kind of an ensemble of approaches to how we do science and get away from these hierarchies and zero-sum trade-offs and dichotomies that may actually do more harm than good. So to just send some acknowledgments out, a lot of the work that I'm going to share has been informed by this group of social scientists and practitioners that we call the Science of Actionable Knowledge, especially Kripa Jagannathan, Katie Mock, Gabrielle Wong-Perotti, and Maria Lemos. And this group has, over the last couple of years, has put out 10 papers that are included in the references, but you can see some of the headlines here. And we have a very malleable and broad definition of what we mean by actionable knowledge, but it's knowledge that informs decisions and actions to advance social and environmental well-being. Maybe filling in a little bit of biography that Monica shared in terms of how I came to be interested in this topic. I moved to Aspen, Colorado just in the last year of finishing my undergraduate work, and I started as a snowmaker over the winter as a ski bum. It was to be my one kind of 3-month period of being a ski bum before I went off and did something else. And quite quickly after moving there, I got connected with this organization called the Aspen Global Change Institute, which some of you may know about. It's an interdisciplinary research center for connecting across disciplines and connecting research and practice on a whole range of global change issues. And early on, the then director, John Katzenberger, gave me this book that had just come out by one of AGCI's advisors called Science as a Contact Sport. And it was really a memoir of Steve's experience working with the media, the IPCC, being one at the forefront, kind of the bully pulpit for advancing the public and policymakers' awareness of climate change. And what was so interesting to me, it was a very breezy book to read, but it brought to bear the idea that there are different ideas about how science should engage with society. And Steve was one of an early advocate for a more engaged and communicative posture. He also raised this question towards the end of the book is, can democracy survive complexity? And for me, this really raised the stakes that getting the relationship, the interaction between science and society fine-tuned in the current context of climate crisis was really an existential problem, question, not only in terms of our ability to solve complex challenges like climate change, but even preserve some of the structures that we hold sacred in our political life. And so anyways, that then transcended into some work that actually Jerry was involved in on thinking about how does science inform climate change adaptation, which really got me started down this road. And as I did, I realized I was late to the party, that especially during the 2000s, there was a lot of scholarship thinking about how do we connect sustainability and climate science to decision making. And the scholars that were engaged in this were looking at examples of assessments and programs that were effectively connecting with decision makers at that time, and starting to reframe what you could argue, they weren't using the word actionable, but usable science or actionable science, not just in terms of the quality of the science itself, but how it was situated in a broader system that involved interaction between scientists and policymakers and practitioners. An early paper by Cash et al. Was one of the first to point out the importance of the interaction between those groups. And then in 2005, my advisor actually coined the term co-production. It wasn't the first use of that term, but it was the first use of it to describe meaningful interaction between researchers and practitioners with the goal of increasing the uptake of science and decision making. And in their evaluation of some of the early generations of the regional integrated sciences and assessment programs that NOAA was funding, that it is in the highly interactive models that the possibilities of higher levels of innovation and related societal impact are most likely to occur. And then throughout the 2000s, a lot of the interest in usable science was actually through a series of papers looking at when and if seasonal climate forecasts like ENSO predictions were used. And this review paper that was led by Lisa Dilling, who's at the University of Colorado, showed how nearly every case of successful use of climate knowledge involves some kind of iteration between knowledge producers and users. So you might ask yourself, looking at all this, well, that looks pretty great, but why was this new information in the 2000s? Why was this, why were these publications getting accepted? Why did people think that this was worth knowing about? Isn't it kind of intuitive based on maybe how other, there's lots of traditions of design thinking, for example, that focus on the interaction between producer and user to make a more usable object. To kind of think about why this was so novel going back a couple decades, I think we need to go back even further to what you could argue is the dawn of the modern science era. And it's a story that you can tell through the perspective of this guy here, whose name was Vannevar Bush. And as some of you might know, he was essentially the top program manager under President Roosevelt during the war that oversaw all the allocations of federal money for research and development for wartime science and technology, including the Manhattan Project. And he did it, if you've been to DC or spent time in DC, he did it from an outpost at the Carnegie Institution for Science up on 16th Street. And this was quite an unusual time because prior to World War II, there was hardly any public funding available for science. Most research was funded either through universities or private dollars. And it was kind of a logical argument to champion the public investment in science during the war. But he was also a very crafty politician and had a vision for what the federal government could do after the war to continue this high level of investment. And he cleverly got the chief of staff of Roosevelt, who was ailing in poor health at the time in 1945, to invite him to write a plan for how to continue the levels of federal investment in peacetime as they had been built up during the wartime. And what followed was this pamphlet called Science, the Endless Frontier. And I go back to all this history because this one document and a lot of the ideas that were encircling it created a much different vision for how we do science than the ideas about a more interactive and engaged approach. And he had all these aphorisms peppered throughout the pamphlet, but one of them was scientific progress results from the free play of free intellects working on subjects of their own choice in the manner dictated by their curiosity for exploration of the unknown. And with a little bit of revision based on some negotiations on Capitol Hill, this essentially formed the blueprint for the National Science Foundation. And it also has had enormous staying power in terms of how science policy is conceived in DC. Prior to the CHIPS Act, which was the most recent huge spending bill for science investment, it doubled the size of the NSF that was passed last year. It was called the CHIPS Act at the very end for political reasons to connect it with the microchip shortage, but it was previously called the Endless Frontiers Act to harken back to this time. So this is an amazingly influential document. And when Bush was thinking about the free play of free intellects, he might have been thinking about someone like this gentleman. This was Niels Bohr, who came up with the kind of initial model for the atom. And he represents this kind of idea of what pure science is. It's a quest for fundamental understanding. And Bush, in creating this blueprint for the NSF and what kind of guided most science policy making thereafter, was very worried that if the structure for science funding was not created right, this applied science world would take over. And this is a picture of Marconi, who invented the wireless telegraph. I put him here in place of Edison, who's typically thought of as the applied science tinkerer. Marconi couldn't care less how the object worked. He just wanted it to work and wanted to make money off of it. And so this dichotomy between pure science and applied science has really driven, I think, a lot of how even I think about research. They're very simple ways to categorize and bin, and even coming out of World War II, a lot of federal research funding used categories developed by the Office of Naval Research to line item money for basic research, money for applied research, money for research and development. So it's a very kind of sticky, bureaucratic organizing principle. But this political scientist at Princeton in the 90s wrote this really interesting book called Pasteur's Quadrant. And he said, wait a minute, so we have this paradigm of thinking about science as either basic or applied. But what about people throughout history that have actually found a third way? And so here is Louis Pasteur. He is considered the founder of microbiology, the discovery of bacteria. But he did his science in consultation and collaboration with beer brewers and dairy farmers, and in his lifetime worked to make safer milk and better beer and many things that could be applied from the results of his more fundamental discoveries. And so Stokes, I think, was not the only one, but one of the main influential people that thought about the ability to break down these silos, that in practice the modes of doing science are much more malleable and flexible. And he called what Pasteur was doing use-inspired basic science. And I just want to say, this is the dead white guy slide of the talk. And I actually started to put in different people. I've tried to put in Marie Curie for Niels Bohr, for example, but apparently, she actually stopped doing her basic research during World War I and started going to the front lines and applying her X-ray equipment to help soldiers in the war. And so I use these people because they've kind of been pigeonholed into these areas by Stokes. And this is all to say that even from the standpoint of kind of Western traditional science, there are many different modes of doing research. And if you zoom out even further and think about more ancient holistic traditions of knowledge production, living indigenous traditions, the realm of participatory community-based research that has a very long history going back to the 60s, institutions all around the world that don't fit neatly into this framework. So this is a very simplified view, but it does make the point that there are different paradigms for how we do science. So, I mentioned some of the literature that really generated enthusiasm about co-production. And so kind of turning back into more recent times and in the climate science community, there has been a remarkable embrace of the idea that climate scientists should engage with decision makers. There was kind of a culminating conference, maybe some of you were at it in 2011 in Denver, the Open Science Conference. David Bihar of San Francisco gave a speech defining this idea of actionable knowledge. And some people you might recognize here summarized the conference as a point made repeatedly by the users of climate information throughout the conference was the importance of their early and continued engagement with scientists. And this idea was echoed in other more official proceedings that were coming out at the same time from the NRC and the National Academy and the US Global Change Research Program. And you can see these ideas really start to pick up in the practice of what lots of geoscientists were doing. This is an analysis of abstracts submitted to AGU and how the orientation towards partnerships and co-production and engagement were changing over time. And so, in the way, I think co-production almost has become a victim of its own success. That there's been this idea that co-production is a panacea that will just make all research better and more usable, and that there's no trade-offs or costs associated with it. And that was the motivation of the formation of this group that became known as the Science of Actionable Knowledge. We met in the auspices of the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center that recently sunsetted in Annapolis, Maryland. That was a NSF project. And one of our first products together was this comment really raising the question, like, how do we actually know when different modes of research are more effective and why? And how do we sort out maybe some of the costs and the potential harm of assuming that engagement all the time is better? And so we kind of took inspiration from maybe a broader field emerging, which sometimes is called the science of science or meta-research, where you apply a scientific lens to the process of science itself to inform how you organize scientific activities. And there's a lot of work that's done on analyzing citation counts and scholarly networks. You can follow it and learn how to up your H-index if you want to, if that's what you're into. We were interested in how we could understand better what drives the use of science in decision making. And some of the questions that we've been thinking about, I've been thinking about, this is just a sample list, and I'll give some example studies that relate to each of these. What are you actually producing when you co-produce, and how do you do it? Is it always better to form closer partnerships, or are there more efficient, lower cost ways to go about it? And thinking about the influential role of funding and all the history of science policy, what is the role of funders and program managers in maybe encouraging or kind of creating this space for interaction? And there's a bunch of other questions that have come out or are coming out in a paper led by Kripa Jagannathan that is a research agenda for SOC. It's going to be out in Environmental Science and Policy. So, one example of a way to kind of apply this science of science lens is an example from Kripa, Andy Jones, and Isha Ray at Berkeley Lab, when they wrote a paper called The Making of a Metric, Co-Producing Decision-Relevant Climate Science. And their goal here was to diagram the black box of co-production, documenting in detail the strategies that enabled or did not enable the creation of decision-relevant science. And they were doing this in the context of what they call a basic science project. It is still ongoing. It's the DOE project called Hyperfacets that's working to evaluate regional climate model data sets, but also to think about them in the context of application. And so the co-production element was to come up with metrics to evaluate these climate data sets that would be relevant to decision making. And in this paper, it's an example of more of a case study. They explain their starting point. Rather than working with practitioners, water resource managers, energy system managers, they, rather than starting in the context of the science and asking direct questions about what practitioners needed, which is maybe a more traditional or direct approach, they started in the context of decision making, understanding the issues and the concerns that were at play for the practitioners, creating indirect questions that facilitated more entry points for decision makers to actually share what they needed in a way that might not have come up if they were just asked the direct questions of what kind of science do you need or what science is relevant to you. The project also invested in the role of boundary spanners. And this is a term of art for people that are really conversant at navigating different worlds. They might be communication rock stars. They might have high emotional intelligence. They might have great cross-cultural competencies, experience working in different institutional settings. And they were positioned to help translate the conversation between what decision-relevant metrics were emerging and what they call the upstream metrics. What could the modelers actually dive into their data set to provide? And some other cool things came out of it. You may have seen this in a related paper coming out of the project. They call it the SWE triangle, a new and more decision-relevant way to look at metrics of snowpack, kind of going beyond the canonical April 1 SWE metric. So here's an example of kind of what co-production can look like in practice, actually within the context of a basic science project. So again, kind of melding or negating these ideas of dichotomies between basic and applied science. Another example of SOC research I can share, a paper I was involved in, we asked this question in the title, "The closer, the better." So, there's been as we've kind of looked at, there's been a great uptake and interest of building relationships and doing co-production, but are there ways to do that more efficiently? And so we created an experimental design with students at the University of Michigan where they were assigned into 3 treatment groups. Some got to interact with a scientist directly in person, some got to interact with a scientist virtually through a webinar, and some got to engage with the same information and resources through a self-guided mode, either through a recorded webinar or through a standalone website. There were 2 different studies combined within the study. And they were, the subjects were presented with a hypothetical decision-making scenario. They were put into the shoes of a practitioner across those 3 treatment groups. And then each was confronted with a questionnaire after the treatment. And we looked at different attributes of usable science. How relevant was the science to the decision context that you were put into in a fictitious scenario? How comprehensible was the information that you were provided? And how credible did you think it was? And so these, in the literature, are some of the attributes that are thought to predict whether science is taken up into decision making. And we were surprised to see across, this is just reporting on one of the studies, but in the both studies reported here, there was no significant difference between the treatment groups. And even when we looked at different kinds of information that were presented, observations, kind of hindcasts of models, and future-looking climate model projections. There was a lot of similarity between these three treatment groups. And there are a lot of, I think, challenges in terms of the study generalizing out beyond the experimental setting. But the idea that came out of this is that while in-person interaction is sometimes effective at enhancing understanding of climate knowledge, in-person interaction may not always be necessary depending on the kinds of information and the outcomes expected. And so this work has been continued by a PhD student, Lisa Mallard, who is doing this as a live randomized controlled trial with practitioners in the Gulf Coast, again, randomly assigning different communities into different treatment groups. It's been going on throughout the pandemic and following. And so it'll be really interesting to see what comes out of that in a more realistic setting, not in the kind of traditional social experiment setting of using 19-year-old college graduates to make assumptions about human behavior. So then the last study that I'll share is one that I led looking at the role of funding in how it influences interaction between scientists and practitioners, and how that can change the uptake of that knowledge in practice. And I had the opportunity to take advantage of an interesting natural experiment that unfolded in the context of a funding program for coastal research at the National Estuarine Research Reserve System. And after looking at the RFPs across 16 years, what emerged to me was that about every 3 to 5 years, the model or the paradigm under which the program was designed changed. It started out very much like a traditional NSF-style program. It then took a bent down the road of how do we commercialize coastal research better, and had requirements of not necessarily working with, but just identifying a company that could potentially utilize the research as a criteria for how the proposal was evaluated. And then an intern at the program took to the senior program officer one of the papers that I cited earlier by Cash et al. Is this knowledge systems paper, and said, hey, there's this research out there that says that it actually kind of depends on this interaction between the science and the user. Maybe we should include that as embed that into our programming. And the program manager said, sure. And so they started to incorporate these requirements for having advisory councils and some level of degree of interaction between the research team and where the knowledge could be applied. And then they just took that a step further in the last generation. And so we looked at 120 project reports, 30 in each generation, and started analyzing them, for example, to see, did the intensity of interaction between the research team, the PIs, and the community members, however they were defined, did it change over time? And it was interesting to see that there were some early stages of interaction happening even without the requirements in the early stages. And by the end, more than half of the teams funded that we analyzed were really at those upper 2 levels of interaction that we coded. And we also looked at, from the standpoint of the project reports, could you identify some change in evidence that the research outcomes were being utilized? And we did, in fact, see this a stepwise increase in utilization of the funded research, but a significant amount of the projects that we looked at really gave no determination whether the research was used or not, which was kind of an aha moment for the funders, that they'd put all this work over 16 years to think about how to produce more impactful science, but not really a framework for thinking about how to ask those that were funded or to find out from those that were funded what was used or not used, other than filling out the standard project report. And they've since continued to kind of adapt and iterate on that. Another interesting highlight from this, we interviewed several dozen of the PIs and practitioners that were engaged in this, and many of them, in speaking to them, talked about how they might have started out applying to this program and adapting their practices in kind of a cravenly opportunistic mode to just fit into what the funding program required. But there was evidence of a cultural shift, that the collaboration and the interaction was insightful, made for better and more effective research, and that even without the requirements to collaborate, that they felt like it was a successful model that they continued anyway in their subsequent research. I guess going back to this guy, I don't know who he is, but it occurred to me in kind of thinking about everything I've just shared as I was putting this talk together. Is this guy like screaming for joy, or is he like pulling his hair out in frustration? And I think there is a sense that I feel of both of those emotions. On the one hand, there's been this amazing kind of groundswell of enthusiasm for thinking and embracing new ideas about how science is created and engages with society. And I've tried to share what we're learning about that. But at the same time, I also feel that the ideas around actionable science or actionable knowledge may be creating a new dichotomy and hierarchy where just implicitly it seems like only good science is that which is actionable, and all actionable science is co-produced. And I think that is just as naive as what I would argue Vannevar Bush had in his way of thinking, where he wrote that applied science drives out the pure, that these dichotomies actually do more harm than good, and create a sense of a zero-sum game, that if you invest more in quote-unquote actionable science, you're driving out pure science, or vice versa. And so maybe to use a metaphor that I think is used in these halls, I'd like to think more about actionable knowledge as an ensemble. First of all, I've shared some progress in thinking about what drives actionable knowledge. There's still a lot we don't know about how people and groups use information to make decisions, and how those decisions translate into beneficial outcomes for society. So to just kind of willy-nilly change the whole way in which we do research based on kind of an aspiration to engage, I think is short-sighted. And we need to continue to experiment across a wide range of approaches. And it's clear that different modes of research can be blended. They don't exist in isolation from each other, and different styles of research can contribute to what becomes actionable. And so thinking in an ensemble approach brings us to a point of evaluating the complementarity rather than the dichotomies. And there is so much specialized expertise, and I think that sometimes gets lost in the conversation, that whether it's work done in data science or modeling or observationalists or people that are thinking about the impacts of climate change on communities, all of that work, in addition to a lot of adjacent skill sets in education and research administration and being a good program manager and thinking about how we maintain research infrastructure, all of these skill sets require a tremendous degree of specialization. They require interdisciplinary settings to integrate and assess it. Co-production, I think, has demonstrated its merit at every stage of the research process to help build credibility of knowledge and fit for decision making, but not everyone needs to be co-producing, and not co-production doesn't need to take place at all time. But running through it out at all, as we saw in the paper from the Hyperfacets project, it was really the boundary spanners, these people that have the ability to forge connective tissue between all of these specializations, that are really some of the essential factors in tying it all together and creating an ensemble. And I think this is sort of an ancillary point, but it's something that I feel like needs to be mentioned more and more, because as we all get the bug that we want to think about how our science gets applied, we all want to go out and start asking practitioners, okay, what do you need? And that conversation has actually happened quite a bit now. we certainly all need to become better listeners, but we also have to figure out what the structure is that we can listen as an ensemble to avoid the kind of errors that may have happened in Alaska, where thousands of scientists just descended and started asking people what they needed and tying up a lot of capacity in places that frankly don't have a lot of capacity for these conversations. If the multimodal ensemble is not a fitting analogy because it just gets everything too confused, I think it's also like this kind of ensemble, an orchestra, where individual players spend years, this is the Berlin Phil, honing their craft, but they have a deep sense of awareness and appreciation for what each other part brings. There's opportunities for soloists, but the soloists are empty without the backdrop of the orchestra, and you have strong institutions that actually house and bring it all together and facilitate the engagement with the audience. So maybe that's another way of thinking about an ensemble. However we want to think about it, I'll just leave with a more recent paper by Parna Bomzai-Dodson and colleagues that really starts to diagram different modes that any scientist can undertake in thinking about how to make their science actionable. These are different, you could say, different levels of interactivity and different rationales that go into each one of them. It provides a space for the more one-way communication that can be really effective for large-scale dissemination, for maintaining a distance from the political fray. But it can also engage the realm that I know many of us are aware of in terms of climate services, entering the consulting space, moving to a more participatory model, which a lot of the literature on co-production, I think, centers in. And then there's this idea of co-production that isn't just about making our science or our tools more useful, but are really about changing the power balance in society. And so kind of going to that higher level creates new opportunities for how we do research. But the point being that you might think about different questions that would help you to identify what level of interaction is most appropriate given what you're trying to do and the context that you're trying to enter in. I have all these citations that I think Monica can share if it's of interest to you. So some conclusions and brief. I'm really optimistic about how we can apply social science. Doesn't even have to be considered social science per se, but just systematic evidence-based analysis to understand how we do our science better. Every time we get a grant and are funded by a project, we're making an imprint on the world and understanding what that is, and if it lines up with expectations is a learning process that we can analyze. Even though knowledge co-production, I think, has unintentionally become co-identified with actionable science, it seems like from the work that has been ongoing over the last couple decades that not all science needs to be co-produced. And even within the umbrella of co-production, there's many different forms and styles of engagement. And there's lots of different talents that people can bring to help create a larger community that has the capacity to produce actionable science. It's not necessarily just actionable science is not something that's necessarily created by the individual. And maybe a more personal reflection, I really welcome the feeling of cultural change and progress that is detectable in a lot of different contexts in the scientific community. But in that shifting, I think we also need to avoid creating a monoculture that's just about doing one thing in one way, or having a divisive culture where people are feeling like someone's approach is actually trading off with another approach. And so that's getting to that idea of working as an ensemble. So with that, thank you for listening. I hope there's time for questions, and appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Okay, thank you very much, James. So I'd like to open it up to questions in the room, but also If there are any questions to come in online, if you're in the room and you have a question, just raise your hand. Okay, so we'll go Christine, Peter, and then to the other side of the room. Okay.
Thanks. That was a really interesting talk. This is sort of a curiosity question. On your slide that you talked about the different generational models
Mm-hmm.
and the paper that I think was published in 2020.
Yeah.
So it ended at 2016.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if that's been extended because each generation was like 2 to 5 years. And so
Yeah.
we should be 2 generations deep now.
Yeah, that's right. So I was doing that study during what you could call the fifth generation, and I was being funded by the way that program was run is that NOAA, and the reason it kind of worked out into these different generations is that NOAA outsourced the program management to different teams of people roughly every 5 years. And so I was able to engage with those funders during that period and help them think about their evolution during that. And then the study came out in 2020 when the next generation 6 started. And they did a few things kind of in response to this paper. They spent a lot more time investing in the design of the review panels. So a lot of the innovation had happened during in the previous period, just in terms of what went into the solicitation, but they didn't necessarily change how the review panels were composed and how they were trained to actually evaluate the kind of collaborative science they wanted to produce. And so that was one of the things that they changed. They also created a lot of toolkits for PIs to learn better how to do collaborative science. They became a bit more prescriptive than so there's kind of a different axis of thought. You sort of embrace collaborative research, but sort of let everyone kind of go out and figure out, the collaboration in their own way. But they became a little bit more prescriptive, and I'm no longer working with them directly. But there's I believe, a PhD student that's trying to continue on the work. So, yeah.
Thanks. So the collaborative science is still like the primary.
Yeah. Oh,
directive?
yeah. It's they're like. They've gone like in the deep end. Yeah.
Great, thanks, James. Really fabulous. And I know that AGCI has had a really long-standing relationship with NCAR.
Yeah.
So you've been able to maybe gauge a little bit what's been going on with NCAR.
Mm-hmm.
Recently, well, not so recently, we had a large loss of human dimensions work here at NCAR.
Oh, yeah.
And sort of, it's almost like we went backward along that line of, like getting more into. And that was sort of a top-down thing,
Mm-hmm.
So there's this bottom-up sort of acknowledgement we really need to be in that sort of actionable and usable sort of domain.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a suggestion, like if NSF is saying it's important, but we're not having the facilities and the resources here to build that capacity?
Yeah.
Is there any guidance you could perhaps give from like AGCI, your own sort of experience, how we could rebuild that capacity?
Yeah. Well, I'm aware of what happened in that instance, and I think just to kind of on like kind of a theoretical angle, I see this scaffolding where you have deep disciplinary specialization that's absolutely essential, and then you have the ability to kind of network that among interdisciplinary peers, which is still in the context of research, but might extend between the natural, social, and physical sciences. And then this more co-productive dimension, engaging with society, is what you might call transdisciplinary. And so I think that it, within, I think it's the tension is, do you try to do that all within the same institution, or do you have a more community-based effort? And I think that either approach can be successful. I mean, part of the role of AGCI over the years has been to provide an independent platform for doing interdisciplinary and now more transdisciplinary work. But if you put me in the decision-making seat, I would love to have more human dimensions work and even more transdisciplinary work happen within an institution like this, because it brings credibility, and it's such a, it's an amazing place for building those connections. So, if it were up to me, I might have made a different decision. But I think that given the decisions that were made, there are other outlets to do it, and you have to, it just, I think, heightens the need to have other institutions and boundary spanners that are willing to go to the extra effort to make those connections. I mean, there's these amazing studies in organizational psychology about just like being on the different floor of a building can stifle creative interactions between people with different perspectives. And so if you design a building better, you foster more spontaneous interactions. And so that does favor having that mix of people within the same four walls and internal opportunities to do it. But it's it's definitely a difficult conundrum. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So Jim has a question?
Oh, yeah.
Thanks. Nice talk. The National Science Foundation's funding model has evolved over time. And it
Yeah.
used to be we got a lot more money for basic science with no strings attached.
Yeah.
And now most of the money seems to be very project oriented,
Yeah.
with a strong focus. What are your views on that?
Yeah. Well, so if I were the head of the NSF, no. Yeah, I think that one could argue, and some have, so I just put out this argument that has been kind of one stream of thought, is that a lot of the evolution of the NSF until recently on broader impacts has created a lot more administration and strings attached to research in the name of broader impacts without really creating a model under which broader impacts could be achieved. And so you could critique the NSF model from the standpoint that it has added a lot of onus and maybe unfunded mandates to have impact in ways that it's not very well set up to do, because you're really just funding the kind of Vannevar Bush style projects with just a lot of add-ons, but it's still in the same structure. So it's a little bit of new wine, old bottles kind of mixture. What is really interesting, and I think this is a story that we'll have to watch unfold and maybe contribute our ideas to. I mentioned the CHIPS Act. Is there anyone familiar with what happened? So the CHIPS Act increased funding across the board for the NSF. It's doubling over the next 5 or 10 years. And it created the first new directorate in many, many decades. And it's a directorate for transformation, innovation, and partnerships. It's TIP. I might have gotten the words mixed up. And that was a congressional mandate to have a more applied division of the NSF that would bring in a whole new set of structures for how projects are selected and funded and who participates in those projects. And I think part of the maybe the recognition was that just trying to put an onus on the traditional NSF model actually might do more harm than good, and that you needed to create this other division with a different logic and way of doing it, kind of different standard operating procedures. And there's a really interesting guy, his name is Erwin Gardanchani, that's the head of it, and he's trying to figure out how to do this, and I think it's on the order of $8 billion a year. So it's a huge, huge outlay of resources. I hope, and I think there's signs that that kind of put into another directorate, that will maybe release some pressure of trying to make everything at the NSF so applied, preserve a space. And again, I'm using these terms that I sort of rejected as dichotomies, but just to be conversant, I think that might provide the capacity for innovating and a more free space in that directorate, while still providing the latitude for what you might consider more basic research in other directions. But I think there is a strain, and this is happening in Europe and in the United States, towards greater measures of accountability in research and research impact. And there's been analyses of different rollouts of those programs, and In some cases, it may just be displacing, like scientists are just chasing after the metrics that they need to achieve, or it's an arms race to write your broader impact statement in a way that will outshine the other guy, or whatever. And I don't know if that's a particularly effective way of going about it.
Okay, thank you. So we have Jerry and then Dan.
Yeah, thanks, James. I think the term boundary spanner that you identified is a really key element to this in making those connections between scientific research and stakeholders. And I think this really became clear to me, I think, at an AGCI session where you brought together water utility managers and climate modelers. And the water utility managers all wanted very specific, deterministic prediction information from the climate models. And the climate models kept saying, you're never going to get that. You're only going to get probabilistic information. And there was this huge disconnect right from the get-go.
Yeah.
And so it became clear that, and we would ask them, could you use probabilistic information? They were kind of, well, we don't know how we do that. Well, maybe, so, and that's, it seems like the boundary spanners making that connection where there's this kind of two-way information where it's not the responsibility of the scientists or the stakeholders to try to explain one to each other, but you have a boundary spanner to actually do that. But then the problem with the boundary spanners is who pays for that? Who funds the boundary spanners? I was wondering if you had any ideas of how that could actually happen in terms of a funding mechanism.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it's not in the references. I think I need to add it, but there's a paper in the special issue that I mentioned called The Attributes of Boundary Spanners. And one of the ideas of that paper was to essentially write down the skill sets and attributes of that position to help make it less of a soft thing where you just kind of, a lot of boundary spanners have emerged just because they tend to be the person that is the glue between people coming from different worlds. And that's great, but then it tends to be that they're underfunded, underappreciated. I know colleagues that kind of get pigeonholed into this boundary spanning role, and they're doing this really sophisticated work of translating across all these worlds and also going and making the coffee, and like they're kind of relegated to a second-class status. And I think having them listed, so there's a couple different models. The Pew Charitable Trust has actually pioneered a model where they hire and fund a boundary spanner and assign it to each of the individual projects they fund. So so it's a little bit more of a kind of a top-down mechanism. They implant someone in that can actually manage that boundary in the project. And there's been some literature evaluating that practice. Another direction that NOAA has taken is training the people that review their grant proposals in the Climate Program Office that evaluate whether adequate resources in the budget are being allocated towards the boundary spanning function. And so really putting a name on that. I mean, part of this is just making, having a term, getting it put into the criteria for decision making so that it's not a soft or implicit criteria, but it's kind of hardwired in, is another approach. And then there's a book that I can recommend. It's called Getting to the Heart of Science Communication by Faith Kearns. And she spent years at Berkeley interviewing all these people that had sort of accepted these odd jobs of boundary spanners in the climate science world. And her whole thesis is that we need to rethink what science communication. She uses the language of science communication, but that we really need to rethink science communication not just as like having a good media office and writing a good press release, but having people that have these highly relational, like high emotional intelligence that can be in the mix of a project and be maintaining the relationships across the communities so that the communication from the project is actually effective, that it's not just a one-off thing, but it's actually part of an ongoing relationship. And so she has a lot of ideas about how to do that better and kind of implement that practice better.
Okay, thank you. So we are actually at the end of the hour. So I know we had a couple of additional hands up, and I apologize, but thankfully James will be joining us for
Yeah.
lunch. So I invite you to come visit him in the lunchroom to continue the discussion. So let us please thank James again for joining us.
Yeah, thank you all for the great questions.